Good morning again, colleagues. I have the honor of moderating this first panel with esteemed friends. I think I can call everyone in this table a friend. With Neemias, the IT Director of the National Assembly of Angola. With Kirsten Gullickson, the Director of Systems Analysis and Quality Assurance of the Office of the Clerk at the U.S. House of Representatives. With Mairéad Keating, the Head of Parliamentary Business Systems Development at the Houses of the Oireachtas here at the Irish Parliament, and Juliano, the CIO of Ágape Consulting. This topic is of the utmost importance, and we decided for this to be the opening discussion because it's how we approach the modernization efforts in the Parliament, how we move forward with smaller pieces, with more tangible increases in the modernization of our parliaments, not trying to tackle everything at once. So how can we provide specialized solutions? How can we move forward with solutions that attend the needs of the members of the business offices in the parliament, and at the same time have one coherent strategy for the modernization and digitalization of the legislative process. So I have invited all of you here so we can have this dual discussion. On one point, how to have the most tailored possible solution to specific business areas that answer to their needs, but at the same time to have those solutions as something interoperable with other elements of the legislative process in the Parliament. So I will give the floor to each one of you to share your opening presentation with the following topic: how are new technologies impacting the legislative process in your Parliament? I will start with Kirsten Gullickson for 5 minutes. Kirsten, you're recognized. I think it's working.
This is good. Thank you, Luís. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm really appreciative of the invitation to start. As Luís said, my name is Kirsten Gullickson. I work in the Legislative Computer Systems Division of the Office of the Clerk in the U.S. House of Representatives. I have two roles. I first lead our 10-person analysis, quality assurance, and product support team. So that means we're on either side of the developers. We're telling them what value to build, and we're also making sure that they built what we asked for. Second, I'm also our coordinator of our Congressional Data Task Force. It's a cross-organizational group of people who help make sure that our congressional documents and data are available in machine-readable language, in addition to a whole bunch of other things that we do with the task force. Again, it's a privilege to be here. When I think about the new technologies that are impacting the legislative process, I often remind myself that the fundamental responsibilities of those of us who support our legislatures and parliaments have not changed. We are responsible for preparing, managing, distributing, and archiving our institutions' official records. Our systems must operate within the rules and traditions and practices of each of our institutions, and our systems and our IT infrastructure must be secure, reliable, cost-effective, right? We can't spend a lot of money, and it needs to be operational when our members and our staff need it. And then on top of it, we need trained technologists and sustained investments to keep it all running smoothly. So we're no longer talking about projects that have start and end dates, but we have products that need to be sustained. Whatever ICT solutions we deploy must support a constantly changing Parliament and be grounded in information that is trusted, accurate, and accessible. And so I suspect that over the next 3 days, we will hear many different stories about how you and your teams and my team are meeting these responsibilities and adapting to change. In the U.S. House of Representatives, technology is no longer simply supporting the legislative process. In some ways, our technology has become part of the legislative process. So I have an example of that. And this is when we formally introduce legislation. So for generations, our members, when they wanted to introduce legislation, they had to physically take a physical piece of paper to the chamber, to the House floor, and place it in a wooden box known as the hopper. Today, that same process happens through what we call the e-hopper. What's remarkable is that the e-hopper didn't simply digitize a paper process. It has become part of the legislative process itself, helping ensure accuracy, capturing critical metadata that we didn't have in the paper process, and connecting information across our broader, larger legislative ecosystem, while still preserving the traditions and rules of the House that existed in that paper process. Historically, legislative work in the House and the Senate in the United States has moved through paper documents, manual handoffs, and physical workflows. We still have to support some of those, but today our technology has become an operational layer that allows those same processes to function. The second major shift that I've seen in my time doing this work is that we're now managing both documents and data. So our job has become more complex. So like I said, for centuries, the United States Congress has just been managing physical paper documents. Today, the US House and Senate must manage the physical document of record, its digital representation, and the data and legislative text contained within it. Through standards such as a Communitoso and other industry-wide structured data models that I'm sure we're all using, legislative information can move seamlessly across drafting, publication, research, transparency, and archival systems while preserving its meaning and authority. The shift is really important because legislative information is no longer created for a single purpose. The same information must support drafting, committee operations, chamber proceedings, publication, transparency, research, and analysis. Information created once is now being reused many times, allowing us to improve efficiency, consistency, and public access, and while maintaining trust in the official record. A third shift in what we centralized the conference around is artificial intelligence and analytical tools. So we all know AI has a tremendous amount of opportunity, but it really reinforces an important lesson. The quality of the answer we get depends on the quality of the data. Authoritative data, shared standards, governance, and interoperability remain essential. So in many ways, AI is highlighting the importance of having that great data that we need to produce so that the systems can use it. These changes are reflected in an ecosystem in our legislature in specialized systems that support different aspects of the legislative work while sharing information across that broader institutional architecture. I've been grounding myself in this thought that our future is not about one single digital platform. It's really about a shared ecosystem of trusted systems within our parliaments that connect that authoritative data, the common standards, and the need for strong governance. Technology will always evolve, right? And we have to adapt as technologists. But our responsibility is also to ensure that legislative information is entrusted to us remains accurate, trustworthy, accessible, and preserved for future generations. And so I want to conclude that I suspect that many of us are wrestling with the same questions. How can we preserve that trust? How can we manage change? And how do we build systems that not only bring value to our members and to the staff and to the public, but how can those systems evolve while preserving our institutional traditions that we are expected to maintain? So I look forward to the conference, and again, thank you for inviting me, and I'll hand the microphone back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for your opening presentation. I'd like to recognize Mairéad now for you to also present in 5 minutes. You're using the microphone?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Luís. Thanks very much, everyone, for your time. I suppose I'm Mairéad Keating. I'm leading on the development of systems for our parliamentary side in terms of our two houses and our committees. We're also in the process of implementing a new legislative system in an integrated way as part of our digital transformation so far. And I suppose I have many years' experience of working on the legislative team before moving to work on the ICT team. So this is an area of particular interest for me. I suppose I'd like to start maybe by recognising one of the points that Kirsten made, which is we can't just digitalise, we have to improve those processes and embed those processes within how we digitalise and how we move forward. In the House of the Oireachtas, we have been on a digital transformation journey for close to 10 years now. We're implementing these new technologies to assist at multiple levels and layers across the legislative system, not really focusing just on streamlining, but making it clearer, making it more accessible, more transparent for all stakeholders, including the public. So I'm going to briefly cover, I suppose, our approach, what we've delivered and what's coming next, I think, which is where we get to some exciting kind of pieces. I suppose, like many parliaments, our legislative process historically depended on standalone systems, very much paper-based workflows, significant reliance on institutional knowledge, on people building up that knowledge over a long period of time. We've taken a modular integrated approach, to digital transformation. And as I said, we're focusing on each element of the legislative system. So from research, how can we help members research in terms of preparing draft legislation, in terms of responding to legislation that is brought before the houses? How do we help members to draft that legislation, to propose amendments to the legislation? How do we help them in terms of their committee consideration, in terms of their engagement at those meetings, as well then as how do we help in terms of making all of that information available to members, to staff, to the public, so they can engage and involve with it. I suppose the key element there is to make sure that we do have reuse of all of that data across all of those streams. Underlying everything that we've done so far is strong governance and compliance to make sure, as Kirsten has said, we are, I suppose, making these changes in a cost-efficient way, that we are ensuring that we are measuring our effectiveness as we go in terms of our delivery, that we are delivering real value for all of our stakeholders. So in terms of some of what we've delivered to date is around real-time parliamentary information through some of our systems to make sure that everybody knows what's happening, when it's happening. We all know that the parliamentary day can change at a minute's notice, so having up-to-date information available, to all stakeholders is really important. Excuse me. I mentioned then the research piece. So we're implementing an AI tool for our research service to assist in, I suppose, producing greater and higher numbers of research papers and briefing papers for members. We're making AI tools available to members to assist them as part of their process, but very clearly, I suppose, the insurance we need to have with AI is to make sure that people don't fully rely on it, that there is that human in the loop, that there is assurance at every step of the way. In terms of the greater clarity during the legislative process, I suppose we've worked very closely with members, with staff, to understand the pain points, to understand what are their biggest issues in engaging with the legislation as it goes through each step along the journey. And one of the issues that we have found is that members juggling a lot of complex demands on their time are moving in and out of committee meetings, and therefore they need to be able to see at a glance what's happening, what is the key procedural information they need to know in that minute, what are the amendments being discussed in terms of groups, in terms of the groups of amendments, so that I suppose one of our systems we're implementing, hopefully next year, will be a committee decision manager, which will allow them to see at a glance that procedural information, to see where they stand and to be able to understand then how they can contribute to the debate. Sharing briefing information in advance with all of the members, capturing decisions and making that available in real time to not only to members but also to the public is also going to be an important step to make sure that we engage the public and bring them closer. Building resilience in across everything that we do in terms of, I suppose, kind of moving to the cloud and making sure that we are, I suppose, robust and being able to consistently deliver that legislative system is really critical. Some of what's coming next, really, I suppose, is trying to make sure that the legislative system becomes much more interactive and much more understandable to the public. And we do, I suppose, all recognise that there can be a gap when dealing with complex legislation for the public to understand not only what's going on, but how do they interact, how do they engage. And some of the ways that we're looking at doing that is, I suppose, through our new legislative system, we will enable members to draft amendments in context of the bill, so that they don't have to try and kind of, I suppose, work in the more paper-based way that we're used to over time. We're also going to be presenting that information to the public so they can see at a glance what different members are proposing and the impact of those proposals in terms of the overall piece of the legislation of the bill. Looking at, I suppose, capturing decisions electronically, giving them to all stakeholders in a way that they can interact with, in a way that then they can engage with their member on in their local constituency. A final element I want to talk through briefly is just through a future committee portal, we're looking at how to bring the public into that legislative process. So from the start, that we often have consultative processes where our committees will engage and seek views of the public, and what we want to do is make that much more readily, I suppose, open for the public to engage with by using electronic system, and allow the public to be able to feed in regularly in terms of legislation that is being proposed. So I suppose overall, really, I suppose kind of some of the key points is making sure that we have an integrated system. We do build it up over time. We do take account of how technology is shifting, but also how procedures, how our democracies are actually shifting. And at the centre of that has to be the engagement between the public and between the members to strengthen that and to make sure that there is real engagement in terms of the legislation that is being progressed through our houses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mairéad, for your opening presentation as well. I'd like to recognize Juliano Bringer for his opening presentation. Juliano?
Olá, obrigado, Luís. Bom dia a todos. Me chamo Juliano Bringer, sou CEO da Ágape Consultoria, e é um prazer participar deste painel representando a Ágape. Somos uma empresa brasileira de transformação digital para o setor público há mais de 20 anos. Trabalhamos com câmaras municipais, algo parecido com os conselhos do condado, parlamentos subnacionais e outros órgãos de governos em várias regiões do nosso país. Nesse tempo, acompanhando parlamentos de portes muito diferentes, percebemos que cada um tem a sua cultura e o seu próprio ritmo de digitalização. Isso nos deu uma visão bem concreta do que tratava a modernização dessas instituições. A dificuldade de tornar os processos mais ágeis, de abrir os dados ao cidadão e de manter viva a relação do parlamento com a sociedade. Mais recentemente passamos a acompanhar também a chegada das novas tecnologias, a este ambiente, inteligência artificial, novas palavras, busca semântica, automação e ferramentas de gestão do conhecimento legislativo. O que me chama a atenção é como, apesar de tão diferente entre si, os parlamentos esbarram quase sempre nas mesmas questões. Como ganhar eficiência sem perder o rigor do processo? Como ampliar a transparência ao cidadão? Como não deixar o conhecimento institucional se perder a cada mudança de gestão? E como aproximar de novo o trabalho legislativo de quem está do lado de fora, que é a sociedade? E a partir dessa experiência prática da Ágape e os seus clientes, acumulada em instituições muito distintas, diferenciadas, que espero contribuir com a conversa de hoje. Se há uma lição que tiramos desses anos, e a tecnologia dá certo no legislativo, não é a que tenta mudar a instituição, é a que entende a missão dela e respeita essas suas particularidades e ajuda a fortalecer a democracia. Muito obrigado, Luís.
Thank you very much, Juliano, for your opening considerations. I'd like to recognize now Neemias from the National Assembly of Angola for his opening presentation as well. Neemias.
Good morning, dear friends. because I want everyone to speak or at least learn Portuguese, I'm moving now my presentation in Portuguese. So once you go in Angola, in Portugal or Brazil, you can speak a little bit Portuguese. Bom dia, caros colegas, caros amigos. Relativamente à questão das novas tecnologias no Parlamento de Angola, o que nós levamos sempre em consideração é que Angola é um país jovem. 62% da população está abaixo dos 25 anos. E isto faz com que nós, da área de tecnologias de informação, que não somos do processo legislativo, pensemos sempre na eficiência do processo legislativo, na transparência e, acima de tudo, na participação do cidadão. Porque, como a maioria da população é jovem, a apetência em tecnologias e também na participação da vida no processo legislativo é muito grande. E foi assim então que eu não vou falar especificamente do processo legislativo, até porque temos aqui colegas que conhecem muito bem como é o processo legislativo. O processo legislativo é bastante mais complexo do que nós imaginamos, e então a transformação deste processo todo para que consigamos ter a eficiência, a transparência e também a participação do cidadão é importante de todo, para que desde o início, das primeiras etapas até o final, consigamos efetivamente digitalizá-lo e não apenas transformar os processos antigos digitalizados. E foi assim então que nós, da Assembleia Nacional de Angola, olhando para a participação do cidadão no processo legislativo, o mês passado inauguramos o canal da TV Parlamento. E com isso nós garantimos o quê? A participação do cidadão, a compreensão do cidadão na parte do processo legislativo, e também ao longo destes anos todos, desde 2014, 2016 e com a pandemia em 2020, conseguimos então transformar todo o nosso processo legislativo digitalizado, mas não transformado em plataformas como tal. O processo está digitalizado, é mais eficiente, os deputados no Parlamento de Angola conseguem tratar toda a informação no digital, já não no físico, o que é bom. E o que nós pretendemos fazer agora é transformar estes processos todos digitalizados numa plataforma, num ecossistema em que todos possam participar. Mas o que nós fizemos também para a participação do cidadão no processo legislativo foi trazer para as redes sociais a parte do processo legislativo. Como o processo legislativo começa, quais são as componentes envolvidas durante todo este processo, e depois a parte final da publicação, e também fazermos a avaliação do impacto daquela lei no cidadão. E foi assim então que nós começamos a pensar também em trazer a parte de redes sociais para que o cidadão pudesse não só participar, mas também acompanhar. Como disse, a juventude em Angola reina, são 62% de jovens. Queríamos trazer este processo de forma que fosse mais transparente, simples de se perceber para qualquer cidadão que acompanha toda a vida do Parlamento. Penso que, como palavras iniciais, era aquilo que me cabia dizer, caros amigos. Luís, obrigado.
Thank you very much, Neemias, for your opening presentation. I also want everyone to learn Portuguese, but for the sake of the majority of understanding, as I will speak in English, if you let me. I prepared a few questions to each one of you, and Kirsten, I'd like to start with you, if you allow me. The U.S. House of Representatives has developed highly specialized ecosystems of digital legislative platforms, including systems such as the e-hopper that you mentioned, the legislative information management system, the Quill, the comparative print suite. each designed to address the operational needs of specific areas of the legislative process, while remaining interoperable within a broader institutional architecture. So, from your perspective, Kirsten, what are the principal challenges in structuring and maintaining this type of modular environment, particularly in ensuring interoperability, data consistency, and institutional coherence across these highly specialized legislative systems?
That's on? Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a great question, Luis, and I want to thank the other panelists. I have lots of questions for all three of you. As you said, we do have highly specialized systems, each built for a unique purpose, but they must be interoperable, and we are moving closer and closer to them really sharing data so that we have that authoritative data source. We are, as you all know, we are bicameral. We have the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and we have two support agencies, the Government Publishing Office and the Library of Congress. And our systems must operate together, and we do have an ecosystem that helps meet that. Luis, you mentioned a number of our systems, the eHopper. We have a legislative information management system. We have a system called Quill, which helps members write letters, and they can write joint letters, and their signatures are taken care of. And we also have the comparative print suite, which does a legislative analysis. But the principal challenges in maintaining modular environments really falls for me into four areas: authoritative data, standards, governance, and then managing change. For the authoritative data, every piece of legislative information must clearly have a defined authoritative source. Without that clarity, systems start to diverge, and even small inconsistencies can erode trust, particularly when information is moving quickly between the institutional work and the digital platforms that we do it. Also, just between the two systems, and maybe even the developers or the teams that maintain those systems, it gets very challenging when we don't know the authoritative data source, and again, that divergence happens. Standards, we have to have standards. Interoperability succeeds or fails on standards. So shared identities, metadata, structured formats. And again, Akoma Toso, United States Legislative Markup is our version of Akoma Toso. And other standards help us keep that interoperability together. It lets us exchange that information reliably. Third is governance. So integration and interoperability are ultimately, for me, a governance challenge. Someone must define ownership, establish permissions, and manage the rules of change. Strong governance ensures that the systems evolve together rather than fragment over time. And once you get fragmentation, it's really hard to bring those silos back together. Sustainability is important. Successful legislative systems must have dedicated staff, engaged users. We need ongoing funding, and institutional stakeholders have to challenge or have to continually championship the value that's being brought by that system. So we have to know what the value is of that system. Technology, again, for me, alone is not enough. We have to make sure that we understand what the mission criticality of a system is. Otherwise, if it doesn't have value and it's not critical to what our members and the staff need, or even the public, then why do we have it? Like, let's take the important stuff and move it to something else. And then change. In the House, one of our challenges is our members are there for 2 years. Sure, we have long-term members who stay, but our champions in their understanding of our technology and the solutions that we're delivering sometimes changes. So it's a constant education of, you've come in here, we're here to support you, here's what we have, and I need you to understand the systems we have. Again, interoperability is not just a technical challenge, it's an institutional challenge, and it depends on relationships and communication and a shared understanding of common goals. So, as I said earlier, I'm the coordinator of our Congressional Data Task Force, And it brings together people from different business units across our legislative branch, across the House and Senate, GPO, and the Library of Congress. And we have found that building those relationships and that shared understanding is just as important as the technology solutions we pick. Those relationships create trust. Trust makes collaboration possible. And in the end, that collaboration enables interoperability, consistency, and alignment across our institutions. And again, that alignment is so key. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for your comments on that. Mairéad, if I can bring a question to you. One of the major challenges in parliamentary modernization is ensuring that the technology adapts to parliamentary procedure rather than procedure being constrained by the limitations of the technology. So, from your perspective, how can parliaments ensure that digital platforms remain sufficiently flexible to reflect the procedural reality of parliamentary work?
Thanks, Luís. I suppose it is an important question, I suppose, and it comes from me back to kind of, I suppose, that the engagement across kind of all of the different areas, from the development to the members to the public stakeholders, and I suppose ensuring that we shape what we're doing around parliamentary procedure rather than shaping it on the technology, because the technology will change, will grow and evolve, and so we need to really have the procedure as our core centre. I suppose that there's four real kind of elements to that. So procedures rather than technology is a starting point, having that modular flexible design, co-creating what we're building with procedural experts, with members at the heart of it, to make sure that we are taking into account their needs and there is that ongoing engagement around that. And then designing with change in mind, not just focused on immediate delivery, but looking kind of down the road as to how things are evolving, actually how things are evolving in other parliaments around the world as well, keeping in contact with that. I suppose, starting with that parliamentary process then, for us, we very much invested significant time in terms of business process mapping, working directly with clerks and with members to understand their, I suppose, interaction, engagement with legislation, identifying where the complexity and where the variation existed, but identifying also then where there was flexibility needed in terms of the configuration of these systems. The modular flexible design, I suppose, in some ways we've had to do this on a modular basis, because you can't kind of bite the entire piece off at once, but it does mean then that there has to be that focus on data, as Kirsten has said a number of times. You have to have that reuse of that data. We have to have that expertise around all of our data stored within our own teams to make sure that there's a clear vision and view, not only of where we are now, but where we need to go to next and how we need to share that information. And I suppose kind of, co-designing and co-creating with procedural experts is something that is a real strength that we've built up within the Oireachtas. We have very much, I suppose, implemented a team of procedural experts. We've brought them across to ICT. They now become the bridge between the procedural team and between ICT. They know and understand both perspectives. They're able to engage and work with members because they've engaged with them on a procedural basis. So they're not just seen as the ICT team over in the corner. So there's the joint ownership that comes from that co-creation, I think, which is really important. And I suppose, part of that can be seen in some of the modules we're developing at the moment, where we've gone and talked to members about that committee experience, about how that operates for them when dealing with really complex or large pieces of legislation, how they and their staff are trying to manage their workload and balance that, because that all needs to be taken into account in terms of not only the system we're building, but also how it will be operated and implemented. And I suppose kind of designing then for change and not just for delivery. The systems have to evolve, so we do a maintenance and enhancement program where we engage with our stakeholders. We look to see what is working well, what needs to improve, what needs to evolve, as well as obviously the technical modernisation that we need to do under the hood in I suppose as a constant piece. So making sure, I suppose, that those systems are configurable rather than rigid, that they're capable of handling the exceptions and the evolution of process as part of our ongoing delivery. So I think kind of those are the key factors for me. So it is that flexibility. It's making sure that we have close governance, that we build that trust, as Kirsten has said. We've built that trust through delivery over the last 10 years, and we need to maintain that now with engagement and regular engagement with all stakeholders. Okay. Sorry. Thanks, Luís.
Thank you very much, Mairéad, for your comments. Juliano, parliamentary digital transformation is not simply the virtual replication of paper-based legislative process. At the same time, however, digital platforms must remain sufficiently aligned with the procedural structure and institutional requirements and the enduring principles of parliamentary work. So, from your experience with no paper across different jurisdictions, how can legislative platforms simultaneously enable meaningful digital transformation while preserving adherence to the fundamental characteristics of the legislative process?
Obrigado, Luís, pela pergunta. A transformação digital do parlamento não se resume somente a passar o papel para a tela, mas há outro lado que aprendemos na prática, utilizando no paper. A inovação que se sustenta também não é aquela que tenta reinventar do zero o jeito do parlamento funcionar. Trabalhamos com câmaras e parlamentos pelo Brasil e vimos que cada casa tem a sua cultura, seus procedimentos e suas particularidades regimentais. Conversarmos aqui na mesa que, às vezes, os procedimentos eles são feitos e, por muitas vezes, se pergunta às pessoas: por que vocês fazem esses procedimentos? Não sabemos, mas temos que fazê-los. É uma coisa que chama atenção e que nem sempre o processo que está no papel é esse processo do dia a dia. Em vários projetos, encontramos rotinas que todo mundo tratava como parte natural desse funcionamento da instituição, mas quando íamos nos regimentos, atos normativos e demais instrumentos que regulam este funcionamento, descobriu que a prática não estava prevista em nenhum lugar. Parecia que havia combinado com Portugal aqui de fazer essa fala antes, porque a gente conversou exatamente isso. E aí que a transformação digital deixa de ser só um projeto de tecnologia e vira um exercício de reflexão institucional. Digitalizar o processo abre uma janela para o próprio parlamento revisar fluxos, esclarecer quem responde pelo quê, reforçar a sua governança e separar o que é hábito consolidado do que está de fato escrito nas normas. E isso possibilita o que o amigo comentou deste relacionamento com a sociedade, com os jovens, poder transformar isso e poder também repassar à sociedade este conhecimento. Daí, uma das lições mais importantes, a tecnologia precisa entender o parlamento antes de tentar mudar o parlamento. Os melhores projetos que nós acompanhamos não foram os que copiaram o papel para o digital, e também não foram os que atropelaram o funcionamento do processo legislativo. O valor está em preservar o que é essencial à atividade parlamentar e descartar o que só era uma amarra operacional. Passar um documento entre várias mãos e não haver uma finalidade concreta. Uma comissão continua sendo uma comissão, um parecer continuará sendo um parecer, uma votação continua sendo uma votação. O que a tecnologia muda e a velocidade dessas atividades, a transparência dos processos, a rastreabilidade das decisões, a integração das informações e o acesso ao conhecimento da casa. Trabalhando em diferentes jurisdições, percebemos que o plataforma legislativa precisa se apoiar em princípios permanentes, mas com folga suficiente para acomodar regras, fluxos e estruturas que variam de parlamento para parlamento. E é esse equilíbrio que permite uma transformação real, sem descolar do que o processo legislativo tem de fundamental. No final, o papel, de fato, da tecnologia não é substituir a lógica parlamentar e as atividades parlamentares, é fortalecê-la. E quanto melhor entendermos este processo, os regimentos, a cultura de cada parlamento, a sociedade, mais a tecnologia vai render para as instituições. Obrigado, Luís.
Thank you very much, Juliano, for your comments. Neemias, allow me to bring my last question on today's panel. That parliamentary institutions often develop digital solutions across different departments and service areas at different moments in time, and frequently involving distinct suppliers, architectures, and technological standards. So from your perspective as the IT director of the National Assembly of Angola, how can parliamentary IT leadership avoid the creation of silos while ensuring institutional cohesion and interoperability across these different systems, allowing sufficient flexibility for the operational needs of each area, while still maintaining a broader corporate strategy for the digital transformation in parliaments?
Obrigado, Luís. Eu vou começar com um exemplo típico de uma situação de transformação digital quando não é nada bem programado. Nós, em Angola, em 2010, usamos uma plataforma para a área administrativa, gestão de recursos humanos, e que, na altura, como não tínhamos nenhuma estratégia de dados, nós fomos usando esta plataforma durante 10 anos. Em 2020, quando começamos com a estratégia de transformação digital, mas a sério, o que aconteceu é que todos os dados que existiam naquela plataforma praticamente foram inúteis. Nós não conseguimos usar os dados. E trago aqui este exemplo justamente para mostrar a importância de se criar um comitê estratégico de transformação digital nos parlamentos. Os parlamentos têm dois processos. E há o processo legislativo todo, e aí falamos da parte política, e depois temos o processo administrativo, e ali falamos das áreas de negócio, finanças, recursos humanos, TIs e outras áreas de negócio. Se os parlamentos não criam uma equipa multidisciplinar para um comitê estratégico de transformação digital, é quase impossível não criar no futuro silos. O mais importante é que se traça uma estratégia, consigamos criar um catálogo institucional de serviços digitais e deste catálogo conseguirmos ter uma estratégia de arquitetura corporativa, governança digital, centralização de dados e também descentralização do consumo nas ferramentas que depois vão consumir estes dados. Quando nós temos um modelo de dado único, nós conseguimos, a partir dali, que todos os ecossistemas ou todos os sistemas, ferramentas que pertencem a esse ecossistema consigam beber os dados. E desde que nós conseguimos criar o Comitê de Estratégia de Transformação Digital no Parlamento de Angola, fizemos com que os dados fossem únicos e várias ferramentas do ecossistema possam beber destes dados. E eu dou aqui o exemplo de ferramentas que nós temos no Parlamento de Angola, em que para o processo legislativo conseguimos tirar os dados de deputados e também para o processo administrativo conseguimos processar salário dos deputados com os mesmos dados que estão no processo legislativo e também conseguimos processar o salário dos funcionários. o que significa que é importante que todo este ecossistema seja desenhado para evitar silos nos parlamentos. Obrigado, Luís.
Thank you very much, Neemias, for your remarks as well. So I'd like to invite each one of you to very briefly share any final thoughts you have for today's discussion. We'll start with Kirsten. Kirsten, would you like to share your final remarks in 1 minute?
Thank you, Luís, and thank you, panelists. I'm scrapping what I prepared for my final remarks because I'm just so excited about what I heard from my panelists, and I have numerous questions for all three of you. And I also want to emphasize what Madrid said and what Neemias and Juliano said is design for change, not just a delivery, which is really important. The technologists also need to be subject matter experts on our legislative procedures so that we can be seen as trusted partners. And I've been on hiring teams, and you can, at least for me, you can see who has fire about not only the technology, but the curiosity about how their institution runs, and they become better employees. You talked about different procedures and trying to fit everything modular. Reminds us of our committees. Our committees always say, oh, we do something unique, and we're always, the foundation is there, right? And then my question for Neemias is about how do you engage the young people, and what platforms and what human-centered design choices are you making to engage the young people? Because I do think that is a common shared challenge, is how do we continue to engage the younger generations into civil society and just our common good that we all need to do. So I'm really excited about the 3 days and get to explore all of this, and thank you for organizing all of us on this first panel. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Mairéad, would you like to share your final thoughts as well?
Thanks very much, Luís. Yeah, and I suppose kind of we're very much in I suppose still in the process of transforming and kind of mapping out our journey over the next few years. And I suppose, like Kirsten, very interested in talking to colleagues now after this and over the course of the next few days. Some of the points raised, I suppose, about the importance of culture, of building that trust, of I suppose sharing that common ambition in terms of how we make Parliament work better for the people who rely on it every day, for staff, for members, for the public ultimately. How do you build that, I suppose, real energy and drive behind that, and then bring that out to the public, I think, which is one of our next challenges, kind of bringing it beyond the doors of Parliament and out into the world. Very much, I suppose, technology is a tool. It's a really powerful tool. It can help us make a huge impact in terms of what we're doing, but I do think that engagement piece and how we broaden that engagement is going to decide how we go for the next 10 years and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mairéad. Juliano, would you like to share your final thoughts?
Obrigado, Luís. Ouvindo os colegas, fica claro, né, que mesmo em contextos institucionais diferentes, esbarramos nos mesmos desafios. Falamos aqui de modularidade, interoperabilidade, flexibilidade, falamos de governança, transformação digital. Tudo isso pesa no futuro dos parlamentos, mas a reflexão que eu queria deixar é outra. A tecnologia sozinha não transforma parlamento nenhum. Quem transforma é a instituição que sabe usar a tecnologia para fortalecer sua missão, guardar sua memória, ampliar a sua transparência e reaproximar o cidadão do processo democrático. As ferramentas vão continuar mudando, evoluindo, vão surgir novas plataformas, novos modelos de inteligência artificial, mas os princípios que sustentam esse trabalho parlamentar seguem os mesmos, e é por isso que nossa responsabilidade não é só sobre construir sistemas melhores, é garantir que essa inovação esteja sempre a serviço de instituições democráticas. A tecnologia corre, os princípios permanecem. Cabe a nós fazermos com que a inovação fortaleçam esses princípios em vez de nós substituirmos eles. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Juliano, thank you very much for your comments. Neemias, would you like to share your final remarks as well?
Obrigado a todos. Mairéad, Kirsten e o Juliano. Foi, de facto, um painel proveitoso para todos nós. Como TI puro, e tenho o sangue de TI, gosto de dizer uma coisa que é: todos os departamentos de tecnologia que se encontram aqui não devem atuar apenas como provedora de tecnologia para o Parlamento. Devemos atuar como orquestradores. Prefiro chamar esse termo aqui, orquestradores da transformação digital nos parlamentos. E isto vai permitir que, ao invés de apenas fornecer para os deputados, para o cidadão, a tecnologia necessária para o processo legislativo, consigamos não só trazer naquele tempo, mas, como Juliano disse, começamos a ver agora a introdução de novas tecnologias. E no futuro, talvez, tenhamos muito mais tecnologias do que apenas a inteligência artificial. E se nós formos orquestradores para o futuro digital dos nossos parlamentos, conseguiremos, apesar dos parlamentos modernizarem-se, conseguiremos sempre manter aquilo que é de mais valioso nos parlamentos: dados, transparência e eficiência legislativa. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Neemias, for your contributions. And with that, we conclude this panel. And I yield the floor back to Lauren for her to announce the next activity. Thank you very much.